My wife is a slave, no slack on housework. Pregnant with a big belly at 9 months, I was pushed away by my husband Alfred, seemingly displeased with me for resting too much amidst my impending early delivery. I don't expect kindness used to being scolded, but today Alfred's eyes seemed different, projecting great anxieties. Ah, just give me alcohol. Alfred drank voraciously, spilling liquor, quickly getting drunk, then fell asleep in the living room, snoring loudly. It appears I'm a slave named daughter-in-law, so I cleaned up empty cans, covered Alfred with a blanket, and quietly raised the corners of my mouth, feeling a sense of empowerment. Claiming to have caught a cold the next morning, Alfred crawled back into bed, but I didn't let it slide. Thanks to Alfred, I can live comfortably. I always appreciate it. A husband's duty is to earn money. Off you go to work. Who knows what will happen there? I'm Mina Jorger, 23 years old, married to Alfred, 12 years my senior, 6 months ago. Yeah, that's good. Alfred nodded contently after tasting the meal, relieved. I let out a sigh. That's how he always praises me. Coming home tired to a tidy room, delicious food, and a beautiful Mina waiting. I'm the happiest man. I carefully do the housework so he can relax a bit. It feels good to be appreciated. Mina, you're lucky to have me as your husband, to have such an elegant wife at that age. Alfred, older than me, is dependable and always leads me. We met at a career fair while I was job hunting, and instead of getting a job, I ended up marrying him. My friends are working hard at their new jobs, so it's true that as a housewife, I live a more elegant life. He specifies the number of dishes for meals and insists on sorting laundry by color and pattern. I attend cooking classes at Alfred's suggestion, so I don't have much spare time, but it's rewarding because Alfred acknowledges me with a smile. Ah, this meat is so good, the best. It was expensive, right? You should thank me. Alfred has always been good at studying and now works for a top-tier company. Well, I am what you'd call an elite, Al had said before. His slightly condescending tone brimming with confidence seemed cool. And now a new life is growing inside me. I believed our home would become even happier. The distortion began around the 3rd month of my pregnancy. 1, 2, 3, only 3 dishes, that's odd. And I so tired that I'm seeing this. Alfred counted the dishes in an exaggerated manner. I'm sorry, I haven't been feeling well, I said. And I started having morning sickness. I can't move as I want to, and the smell of food makes it hard to cook. Alfred listened to my story without moving a brow. I wanted him to understand my pain, but it felt like I was just making excuses. Ah, I see, he said, nodding slightly. Imagine this, Mina. We go to a restaurant. The chef says, "Sorry, I'm not feeling well," and only serves an appetizer. Is that acceptable? I shook my head. Next, we go to a play. The leading actress says, "Sorry, I'm not feeling well," lies on stage without makeup, and doesn't act. Is that acceptable? I looked down and shook my head again. Right, it's not. That's negligence of duty. If I were a customer, I'd be furious. But what you're doing now, Mina, is just that. Alfred peered into my face deeply, bowing. Am I supposed to take care of Mina like a pet? If a housewife doesn't do housework, what's her worth? You're just planning to leech off me, aren't you? I'm sorry, my voice was barely audible as I apologized again. How ugly. Imagine how I feel having a gloomy wife like you in front of me. And why are your lips blue? Can't you at least put on lipstick? Makeup is a woman's manners, even as a housewife, disconnected from the outside world. Don't neglect that. I'm sorry. I don't know how to make him understand the pain of morning sickness. I was just managing not to vomit, with no energy to argue. All I could do was apologize. After this, Alfred changed. When he returned from work, he would sigh heavily, criticizing my appearance and the food I prepared. Wow, did you even put on makeup? Yes, maybe it's a bit light. So your ugliness seeps through even with makeup. You look like a tired old hag, even though you're still young, Alfred said, running his finger over a shelf, blowing away the dust. He frowned while eating, saying my sad face made even the finest cuisine unpalatable. Gradually, Alfred's return home shifted to delayed at night. He didn't want to see my face or eat my cooking. Morning sickness means you can just lay around all day. Pregnant women are lucky, he remarked, leaving the house. I'm grateful to eat out because our home is so uncomfortable now, Alfred said. No matter how late it was, I always greeted him when he came home. That was all I could do. Alfred wouldn't even touch my slightly swollen belly. Instead, he avoided me with disgust. Welcome home, I said, but there was no reply, just a click of the tongue as he swiftly passed by, his scent provoking nausea. When cleaning his clothes, I tried to hold my breath. The smell was unbearably bad. I never minded Alfred's smell before. Is it the pregnancy? No, it's not just that. I picked up his suit, grimacing at the scent from the pocket of the discarded suit. I pulled out receipts, coins, and crumpled tissues, smoothing out the crumpled receipt from a casual French restaurant for two. Alfred had said deli food was better than mine, but who did he take to such a fancy place? The reliable Alfred I loved was gone. I realized the suit carried a sweet perfume scent, noticing the shadow of another woman. But for the sake of me and the baby, I needed Alfred. Crumpling the receipt again, I blamed myself for being cheated on, resigned to endure for now. Sunday morning, Alfred woke up leisurely, sitting at the breakfast table for the first time in a while. As I prepared breakfast and smiled, handing him a plate, he grimaced, criticizing my appearance and weight gain. I tried to explain it was because of the baby, but he continued, lamenting my loss of youth and obedience. Alfred scrutinized me, lamenting his choice and emphasizing the necessity of independence. Once I wanted to be employed and independent, but Alfred strongly opposed it, insisting I marry him instead. At work, there are people who take maternity and parental leave. They don't whine about morning sickness. They work normally, he'd say. Nausea overwhelmed me, and I rushed to the bathroom, his words piercing my back as I left. Running away must be nice, not having responsibilities as a housewife, he'd scoff. Without Alfred, my unborn child, and I couldn't survive. I had to endure. Late-night returns were still better than his days without contact, yet he'd demand meals even if he might not eat them himself. On such days, he'd leave restaurant receipts for two in a suit pocket, enjoying dinners with someone else before tormenting me at home. But I couldn't live without him, though his attitude worsened by the day. As my belly tightened and I felt the first kick, I realized I too was becoming a parent to this child. I couldn't just rely on Alfred. It was the moment I felt parental responsibility. Working and becoming independent during pregnancy was difficult, but I managed housework without upsetting Alfred, taking care of him when he returned, even as my morning sickness eased. I could manage more housework. Please enjoy your meal, I said, eyes downcast, as Alfred looked down at me with satisfaction. Though he still seemed to enjoy himself outside, things were superficially peaceful. But this peace didn't last long. I developed a condition threatening preterm labor, avoiding hospitalization, but having to rest at home, unable to even do minimal housework. Fortunately, Alfred rarely came home, which was a relief. However, when he did, he would berate me terribly. "You're sleeping again, a woman who just sleeps all the time." Being a wife, I really drew the short straw, he'd say. No matter how much he insulted me, the fact that I was just sleeping made me apologize. But one day that suddenly changed. It was the final day of my 9th month of pregnancy. The next day, reaching full term, the bed rest would finally be lifted. Alfred, who unusually came home in the evening, started yelling at me as soon as he saw my face. Startled by his yelling, I quickly hid the tablet I was holding. "You're slacking off again. I'm working hard outside," he shouted, throwing his bag on the floor. Shaken, I shrank back, apologizing with a trembling voice. But instead of enjoying harassing me, Alfred appeared to be projecting his great anxieties. "Don't be so spoiled. Wives are slaves. Don't slack off on housework," he yelled, pushing me to the floor. Frustrated, he punched the wall several times before drinking heavily and passing out in the living room. Cleaning up, I covered him with a blanket, quietly raising the corners of my mouth. The next morning, I woke him up for work, but he just mumbled about having a cold, refusing to go. Checking for fever, I found none. "Shut up, I have a cold," he grumbled, his throat and head hurting. "I'm going to have a fever soon," Alfred muttered, shrugging off my hand and covering his head with the blanket. "Okay, I'll make oatmeal then. If my husband claims to have a cold, it's my duty as a wife to make oatmeal," I thought, quickly preparing it and offering it to Alfred. "Eat this, then go to work?" I insisted, but he replied energetically, "I'm taking the day off." Faced with my smiling self, Alfred frowned. Determined to make him go to work, I cleaned up the living room he had messed up, mindful of my health, but working as a wife. "Thanks to you, I can live. I always appreciate it," I said, patting his back, which seemed to lack his usual confidence. Forcing him to get ready, I headed to the station, pushing him onto the train and holding onto his arm to make sure we didn't get separated. "Why are you even coming with me?" Alfred asked. "You said you're feeling bad, right? I'm worried, so I'll come too," I replied, intending to make sure he didn't skip work. "I'm not feeling bad anymore," he protested, but I insisted. "That's good to hear. But I said I'm going shopping, right? Why go so far? You can shop near home." In the crowd, Alfred seemed too drained to yell, resisting futilely despite my unnecessary detours and slow pace. He seemed off despite his futile resistance. We arrived at his office, a bit past the start of the workday. Worried about Alfred's tardiness, a man came out to greet him at the company. "Hey, Jaeger, you're late. Executive hours, huh?" The man's mouth smiled, but his eyes were sharp and intimidating. Firmly grabbing Alfred's arm as he tried to back away, he dragged him inside. Terrified, Alfred reached out to me for help. "Mina, please work hard," he said, unsettled. "Mrs. Jaeger, right. Thank you for bringing Jagger here. We have an important discussion. Would you like to join us?" The supervisor asked kindly. "Yes, of course," I replied, as Alfred tried to make himself as small as possible in a pipe chair. The man introduced himself as Alfred's direct supervisor, accompanied by an older man showing clear anger and a sulking woman, Miss Simmons, from Alfred's department. "Jagger, anything to say?" The supervisor asked in a low voice. Alfred looked down in silence. "If Jagger won't speak, let's talk about what we know. Despite having a family, you've been quite close with Miss Simmons from your department," the supervisor continued. Alfred glanced at me, biting his lip with pride as high as Everest. An affair? What are you talking about?" "I have no idea. It must be a misunderstanding." Alfred's voice was barely audible, trying to defend himself. "Then look at this," I said, presenting several intimate photos of Alfred and Miss Simmons. Astonished, Alfred seemed to ask how, looking back and forth between me and the photos. "Yesterday, everyone at work found out about your affair, right? You came home like you were fleeing. I wondered what you'd do the next day and beyond. How long were you planning to skip work with that childish lie about catching a cold?" Alfred's eyes widened in shock as I revealed that I was the one who reported the affair to the company. Speechless, he opened and closed his mouth like a fish. "Are you kidding me? You involved the company over a mere affair." He spat at me, not caring that we were at his workplace. "I just reported it since the other party seemed to be a colleague," I replied calmly, "and you think you'll get away with this. Now that the affair is out, I'll face a pay cut or demotion. You realize that means less income, right? Even you'll be in trouble, especially with a baby on the way." Using the child as leverage now, when he never showed interest, was despicable. Alfred continued, his face turning red with anger. But I remained calm. I acted precisely because the baby is coming soon. Wives are slaves, right? I can't imagine this moral harassment stopping once the baby is born. I don't want to raise a child in a home where it's normal for the mother to be abused. No chance a moral harasser and cheater like Alfred will change and become a good dad. We don't need a dad who's a detriment. I want a divorce before the baby is born, I declared. Alfred, rejected by a wife, no, a slave, was frozen again. I always thought Alfred was a confident and composed adult, but under pressure he couldn't even make a decent excuse. The disparity from his usual cool demeanor was pathetic. It's only natural Mrs. Georger would give up on you. Now, let's have our discussion. An older man spoke up. I wasn't the only one unable to forgive Alfred, I thought, watching him slump with tearful bitterness. Why is Mr. Simmons, the COO, involved? This is overkill, Alfred muttered, expressing shock. Mr. Simmons, the COO, was showing an unusual amount of anger for just an employee's affair scandal. Suddenly, Alfred exclaimed in shock, "You dare to mess with my daughter." After looking around, Alfred realized Mr. Simmons was Miss Simmons' father, the same Miss Simmons who was Alfred's affair partner. I couldn't settle for just a divorce. I reported the affair to the company, thinking Alfred deserved a pay cut or to be shunned by everyone. But when I got Alfred's supervisor on the phone, even he sounded shaken. "You're doing this with your wife in her final month of pregnancy," Mr. Simmons' angry voice echoed. With no choice but to respond, Alfred quickly apologized profusely. I'm so sorry," he pleaded. "My daughter knew you were married and yet got involved with you. I'm deeply disappointed in her. I'm sorry for what she did to your wife." It turned out Miss Simmons was the single mother Alfred had once mentioned. Perhaps Alfred, fed up with me, a useless housewife, was drawn to her managing both work and parenting. But in reality, Miss Simmons had given birth unmarried and left the child rearing to her mother while she went out. That's why Mr. Simmons had used his connections to get her a job, wanting to keep an eye on her. She was still somewhat neglectful of her child, but surprisingly, she attended work diligently, which had reassured Mr. Simmons. And to think it was all for meeting Alfred. The thought was unbearable. "I'm sorry. I've broken up with Miss Simmons. We're completely over. I'm so sorry." Alfred frantically apologized as Mr. Simmons confirmed, gripping Alfred's head. "How come scum like you, with no value in passing down your genes, always seem to have such strong reproductive capabilities?" Mr. Simmons seethed. "An apology won't cut it. You may have broken up, but your crime doesn't disappear." Alfred collapsed to the floor as if his bones had turned to jelly. "It's not true. There's no child," he weakly denied. But his feeble denial only ignited Mr. Simmons' fury. "Of course not, because you persuaded my daughter to have an abortion. Sorry won't fix this." Mr. Simmons punched Alfred, who cried out for mercy. Turning away from the scene, Miss Simmons, who had wanted to have a child with Alfred and marry him, came to despise him after being forced to abort. Miss Simmons was selfish for having an affair, but Alfred, who toyed with her, was the worst, I thought, meeting Alfred's gaze as he accused me. "Mina, it's cruel, too cruel," he said. "Yeah, it is cruel," I agreed. Having accomplished my purpose, I left the conference room, stepping into the corridor as the onlookers scattered. There was probably no place for Alfred in the company anymore. After that, Alfred and I divorced. I had always thought about divorcing him. I just bided my time and endured, pretending to be strong until the end. Alfred was easily divorced, and the company's decision was to fire him. He struggled to accept the dismissal, protesting vehemently. In reality, I had submitted various evidence to the company. Frequent messaging during work hours was just the start, claiming to be on outside appointments, but frequently resting in hotels, even worse. He charged those expenses to the company. There was no room for defense. After splitting with Miss Simmons and losing his job, Alfred came back to me despite already being divorced. I wondered what face he would show up with once everything was taken from me. I realized what's important. I want Mina more than status or honor. Has our child been born yet? "I want to meet my child," Alfred expressed. I heard that Alfred's parents were furious with his foolish actions and had disowned him. They had looked forward to embracing their grandchild, only to have their hopes shattered. A jobless, middle-aged son returning home certainly wasn't a joy. It's no surprise that he wasn't even allowed to enter his parents' house. Unable to rely on his parents, Alfred moved from his expensive apartment to a cheap one. His pride hindered his re-employment efforts, and he had to pay compensation to both Miss Simmons and me due to the divorce proceedings, leaving his savings nearly depleted. I felt no sympathy. Lonely enough to seek out a slave like me, that's how alone he was. My child? What are you talking about? My child never had a dad from the start. Better to proudly say there's no dad than have such a man claim the title, I asserted, perhaps taken aback by my firm stance. Alfred left deflated. I'm now living with my parents. When I decided to marry Alfred, they worried about my young marriage. I insisted it would be fine, which made it harder to confide in them about Alfred, but they seemed to have anticipated my feelings. When I finally broke down and confessed about the moral harassment and affair, they comforted me as if they had always known. "It must have been hard for you," my mom said. I delayed mentioning divorce because I wanted to gather evidence to secure an advantageous position. My parents must have been worried sick about leaving their pregnant daughter with an abusive husband, yet they respected my decision and watched over me. When I was immobilized due to the threat of premature labor, my mom would come to the apartment to clean and cook for me. I think I wouldn't have been able to escape from Alfred without my parents' help. "I'm sorry for always causing trouble," I expressed, feeling guilty for failing in marriage and returning home with a child. My mother smiled gently. "You know, taking care of a baby is hard. Diapers leak, nights are sleepless, and babies always cause trouble. But I'm happy as a mom. You understand, right? No matter how much trouble our own child causes, it's never a burden," she said, feeding the baby milk. Her profile was so tender, and I felt like I had reverted to a child myself as I hugged her. Softly, she stroked my head with the same warmth